right, welcome back to the Open Peace Podcast, everyone. My name is Abud Kohen. I'm going to be your host today, and we have our two special guests, Or Halamish and Rafi. Rafi, remind you of your last name, Rafi.
Gassel.
All right. Welcome. Very happy to have you guys on. And today we also are reminded today the podcast, it becomes 1 year old. So we started the podcast a year ago, exactly today. It's been a really long journey. It's been a beautiful one. We had like 53 episodes, which is really amazing. We never thought that we are going to reach that many episodes. We've met really awesome episodes. Awesome guests. Rafi, you also this is I think your second or even third time.
Yeah, second time.
All right. Would you like to give us also a short introduction about your work or what you do for people who are meeting you for the first time?
Sure. My name is Rafi Gassel. I live in Jerusalem, Israel. My day job is working in biotechnology, doing deep sequencing and DNA-related services and products.
Mm-hmm.
And as a pastime, since I was in university, I've been a peace activist for Israel-Palestine since I was in university in America, and I've been in Israel almost 15 years now, living in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And over the time, I've sort of spoken to a lot of other people who are into the idea of some kind of federation or confederation, alternative solutions to the two-state solution. I'll give Or a chance to talk, and then I'll go more. I guess I'll go more into.
Thank you for that, Rafi. Go ahead, Or, please.
Hi, I'm Or Halamish. I'm a Jerusalemite and a Tel Avivian in the same time. So I grew up in the two Israels that exists. My background in the military was actually in the strategic division and foreign relations. So I did have the opportunity as an officer in the IDF to work with foreign entities that Israel works with. If it's Lebanon, Syria, yes, we are working with them in some ways. As well, Egypt in a much more integrated way, and Jordan. And yes, also with the in areas in the West Bank in Gaza, in order to, in the end of the day, to de-escalate the conflict and minimize the conflict as much as possible, in order for one day to have a better future for all of us. And currently, I am actually in the financial world. So I did do switch of careers after working in the Israeli embassy to the UN, but I'm still concerned about the future of Israel, the future of the Palestinian people, and this thing is, very personal, as my friends and family still live in Israel, and I will probably maybe come back very soon after finishing my studies here.
All right. So good luck with that, Or. Sounds amazing. So have you worked with any Palestinians yet, or yet?
Yes, actually, I've worked with Palestinians, both on the professional level, and I'll be frank, since my first grade in Jerusalem, we had Palestinians in our school. I grew up in the East Jerusalem, known, and I've been living nearby many Palestinians and many Israeli Arabs, and it's something that I have a lot of friction as a child. And unfortunately, as a child, also I experienced a second intifada, so naturally it does affect the way I do view things.
How old are you, by the way?
Currently 29.
20, okay.
Yes.
Because I try to remember the second intifada. It was in the 2000s, so I remember I was in the first grade, and I do remember a few things from it. I'll share.
I feel old, guys. I was 18. I was also here in Israel.
So you probably have a good memory, Rafi.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm not sure if you both know. I'm from the Samaritan community, which basically lives between. There's two communities. There's one that lives on Mount Gerizim. That's where I live, which is located kind of near Shechem, Annapolis, or Ariel, the settlement Ariel. And also another community that lives in Holon in Tel Aviv. And what's special, I think, about the community that lives in Mount Gerizim here is that we have both IDs, the Israeli and the Palestinian one, which puts us in a specific perspective of, in certain perspectives that we can, I think normal Israelis would not easily have, because we go to Nablus sometimes every day, in a sense. So today, as the title says, we're going to kind of discuss a little bit about a subject that I have been curious about, and I think it's a really complicated subject. I'm sure an hour or something is not enough, but I'm still convinced I'm going to learn a little bit about, from you guys too. I want to know more about what are people thoughts about this. What's general public about saying about one state or two state solution? What is the dominant, belief of what should the solution might be if it's a solution? And I'd like to also maybe share my opinion of what I think if I see that what both offer basically. I want to know what I might be heading or being biased towards more, if you know what I mean. So let's begin by talking about maybe let's go for the first state, one state solution. Would any of you tell me exactly what would that mean and what's the dominant opinion of the public of what that means? What government's gonna change or something? Anyone would like to begin?
Sure, I could start. So I would say most people, I mean, I can't speak for the Palestinian side, obviously, but on the Israeli side, there is not so much hope for either solution. I guess you could have it maybe a plurality. The largest group of people want some version of the status quo, or just don't believe that there's going to be anything better than what there is now. I would say a large group of people want some version of a two-state solution. And there's a growing number of people that are interested in exploring alternatives, what it would be like to have some kind of alternative one state or a federal state. So, I mean, I came up with an idea with the Palestinian friends for a plan with Zahir, who was also on the program. We sort of co-wrote a plan. We said, we both sort of didn't think that two states were realistic. We said, I feel, emotionally and, culturally connected to the whole land. Let's say we were going to share the country. What would be the rules of engagement for doing this? Like, let's say we had to. You and me were sitting in a room, and we were tasked to write the Constitution of the Federation of Israel Palestine. What does that look like? What could you and me agree to that we would be able to live together and make that a reality, make that work? Under what terms would I be willing to live with that? So it was an interesting sort of thought exercise. In terms of me personally, I'm not against two states, as like I have some friends like maybe Yehuda Cohen, who was probably also on this project, and some of my friends who are, even though I'm Dati Lumi, I'm not so like ideological. I'm pretty like liberal, open-minded guy. So I'm not against two states from an ideological or religious perspective. I just think that there's a lot of challenges to making two states happen in terms of practicality. The challenges with two states are things like Jerusalem, where I live, dividing a city physically or geographically, or not dividing it and having it be in two countries with open borders. The whole issue of all the settlements and how to create borders, or either fluid borders or closed borders, which would be even more challenging. Issues of refugees, security questions. It becomes very complicated.
And even like I think I want to add one more thing on I work in I have a second job. This is like customs and forwarding. Like so, people who buy packages from outside, like Palestinians, if they want to buy something electric, for example, they need a certain permission. It's kind of called kamat, which means like this is going for the West Bank, so they need a special permission because it's going to the Palestinians, which kind of might. It is believed that this is a kind of a dual use. This has a dual use. You can use it for a laser, but you can also use it to, as in like bad things or terrorist acts or something like that. So that's also something that's taken into account.
Right. Security. So the challenges of two states are you could convince a large number of Israelis in theory to support a version of two states. You could convince a large number of Palestinians to support a version of two states. But that version would not be the same that one side would agree to. When you started getting into the details, there are a lot of sticky issues that make it very challenging to fulfill. Whereas the federation, at least as we sort of envision it, all those problems were much easier, like refugees, borders, settlers, all that stuff was solved. The things that became more challenging were the issue of narrative, how I see myself as an Israeli, as a Zionist, how I reconcile the Zionist narrative. It's accepting like the Ben-Gurion's vision of a Jewish state, meaning a state that has a massive 80% Jewish majority, is what it means to be Zionism. So sort of re-envisioning how I define myself, and also the Palestinian, accepting the narrative that instead of seeing the Israelis as these colonizers. And then whereas the two-state is much fits with the narrative much better. If you had the idea of I'm a Palestinian, this was historically my land. These foreign people came and invaded, but I've compromised, and this is the side where it's still Palestine. Even though I feel attached to there, I've accepted that this is Palestine. This is where I'm identified, and vice versa for the Israelis. Like we believe historically of thousands of years of history here, but we've settled because we're modern and moralistic, and we'll set it. Okay, we agreed to a border because we want to live in peace, and
I am leaning towards when it comes to more realistic. I might go towards a two-state solution in a sense.
Right. It feels good with your narrative. The story is easier to tell. That's the things that become hard with the one state are the things that are very easy with the two-state. But the things that were hard with the two-state sort of melt away. The problems of Jerusalem, well, it's just the capital of the country. Right. What do you do about settlers? Well, they just live there. Those things are no longer problems. But
I see what you mean.
Right. Yeah, so it's a different way to look at it.
All right. I feel like there's so much to talk about. So like you opened a lot of doors over here. But I would like to also see what is your, like, do you think there's something more realistic than the others? Sometimes when we talk about one-state solution, people think you're naive, or even two-state solution, people think you're naive. What do you think is?
So I was actually, in the beginning, I was thinking to say, but maybe I lack imagination, so I cannot imagine a one-state. Okay. However, after hearing what Rafi is saying, I think he is also lacking imagination of how a two-state can easily happen, not according to the current demands about the current expectation from both sides. If it's the 67 line, which is a big issue, if it's Jerusalem, if it's a right of return, and many of those issues can actually be solved within a framework of a two-state solution. And this is why we need to remember that a two-state solution doesn't mean necessarily it's hard borders for both sides. As I think, Abu Cohen, you actually described something very simple. You are actually maybe a resident or a bridge between those two states. You even say, oh, I drive to this place, this state, or this entity, which maybe one day will be a state. And
right, it's on like the other hand, right?
Well, yeah, you're in between, I will say. True. But I think you do see that there is a reality, but it's already a two-state reality. But the question, but I think the main problem today is that one state is currently much more established, which of course I'm talking about Israel, and the other state is still trying to form its grids. It's still trying to form its territorial existence. It's still trying to form its political existence, and it's a process that it's really possible to go back, because the moment we're talking about a one-state solution, unless you're talking about right now Israel somehow taking control of the West Bank and Gaza, which, again, I apologize, my imagination is not far away to this place. I don't see any place where Israel is liquidated, or the PA is liquidated, or Hamas is liquidated, and everyone is sitting down to write a constitution and form a country. And forming a country, it's a process of forging that usually takes hundreds of years. And for the Palestinian, it took at least, I'll be frank, it took a process that took 100 years to be where they are, and also for the Israelis. And it's not a process that can happen overnight. And I think Rafi will agree it cannot happen overnight. And maybe in the future we can have a reality. By the way, I'm open for a one state in theory. However, I cannot see a reality that we are forming a one state before starting the process of a two states, maybe slowly integrating in the future. And this is, again, a process that can happen for 100 years. But the two states reality is something that can happen in the near future. And we just need to make sure that the Palestinian state has the same integrity and the same self-respect and the same economic independence and political independence and political voice that Israelis experience. And this is where I, as Israeli, I can always say what the Palestinians can do, but I, as Israeli, need to concentrate on what Israel can do. And many of those steps have already been happening for the past 30 years or so. And we need to recognize that today, every Israeli institution, okay, if it's from the government or the parliament or even the courts, are recognizing a reality of a two states to be happening. And I know we had a very quiet, let's say, 10 years politically with the issue of the two states. But even Bibi, but let's describe it as the right wing in politically in Israel, even him, his official policy was a two state. Not because he wanted it, not because he liked it, because he understood this is a reality that will happen either way. I think this momentum of history is too strong to even go back and try to form a collection of cantons, although it's a great idea, don't misunderstand me. But even Switzerland, its formation was much more organic than artificial. And I'm afraid of an artificial implementation on two nations that are still fighting each other.
Wow, I think that when we go to when we want to compare the two solutions, one thing that we might notice, like that you can compare, is that one state solution might say that there's no borders anymore, in a sense, but two-state solution will focus much more on borders. And I'm not sure what will cause, I mean, I don't want to say problems, what will fix more solutions. Is it borders between the Palestinians and the Israelis, or no borders? Because now we know that there's I think more than 1 million. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I don't know. No, probably less than 1 million. But there's a lot of workers from Palestine to go to Israel. Like, there's many that cross to work there. So my real question would be: do you think it will cause a problem to have no borders? Do you see where I'm heading?
Well, even today we have some form of an agreement, and to the audience that do not know, there are, I'll call it three tiers, there are other tiers, but the three main tiers of visas, kind of like of an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And if we're having a reality, and this is actually where the conflict is becoming the complicated part of the conflict. For the Palestinian person, it's actually easier to go to Israel than to go to many other countries in the world, because the Palestinian entity is still not independent enough to even do visa agreements with other countries. And if it's be more independent, we can talk about a reality where visa agreements between Israel and the Palestinian state can be much more loose, much more liberal, and maybe one day even, and by the way, this one day can be very quick, something that is more similar between like the Netherlands and Belgium, where you do have a border, where you have a clear line of jurisdiction. However, people can freely travel from one place to another. Maybe also Ireland and England is also a great example. But in the end of the day, also the Palestinians deserve the independence and self-respect to decide their own fate with the Israelis, and not Israel forcing a narrative or forcing a legalistic system that Israelis are comfortable with. And again, two states can be, as if they're peaceful, their borders can be as unseen as they are in Europe. And but at least it can be a process that can be slowly built in a legalistic way, in a way that can actually you see progress, and in a way that everyone feels comfortable with.
It's interesting because I cross borders. Like, I have to cross a border when I go to any Israeli city, because basically I'm outside the green line, if you want to call it. And it's funny to say, like even though I hold both IDs, that will make my life much easier to have no borders, because especially when I get asked for my IDs and they see my name as like starting with Abdallah and then Cohen, Abdallah Cohen, and so I kind of get nervous, especially on the bus, if I get asked and people might give me the looks and the bus is full, so I might get a little bit not comfortable for a bit, although I got used to that. What I'm trying to tell you is that borders they are kind of I think they can be a problem in a sense, but like you said, it can take a while to formulate a correct border that is suitable for everyone. Like you said, like Europe borders, in a sense. So that might be.
And by the way, we see this process happening in other countries in the world. Let's actually take an example, but not many people know. It's the African Union. And the African Union, we're talking about a collection of states that are relatively new. They're still trying to form their own identity. But there's a very great example in the East African Union, but are trying to create a bloc within the African Union of easier visas, easier investment and capital trade. And those things do take time, but we see already those fruits happening within relatively a short time, 10 years. And we're talking about countries that just fought each other not too long ago.
Sure.
Yes, Rafi?
Oh, maybe he's talking about the East African Federation. There were seven countries in East Africa that are trying to form like a federation. And when I in the version of one state that I had sort of envisioned, and several people, there are still borders between whatever entities, cantons, or you could have states. But the difference is that these are internal borders within what would be like one country, like the difference between New York and New Jersey, or various states in Switzerland or in Germany or in Argentina or India or numerous countries that have subdivisions of the country. Okay. So you could still have different jurisdictions and local governments, governorates, or whatever you want to call them, cantons, states, subcomponents of this, what would be this country, but there would be some sort of national government or federal government that would manage the system as a whole. That would be the main difference. And in terms of sort of liquidating Israel or liquidating Palestine, I don't see it as sort of it's as sort of
destroying. Can you help me understand this form before we continue? Can you help me understand what does that mean exactly? Liquidating.
They're a sick. I don't know, to get rid of.
Well, I have an example to show you the problem of liquidating an entity, not even a country. For example, in the past, I'll say 50 years, and especially in the past 10 years, the city of Tel Aviv and the Ramat Gan area, which has also, I don't know if people know, there are many other collection of cities. If it's Ramat Gan, Givatayim, Bat Yam, Herzliya, etc. And for a very long time, there's a talk, for example, to joint Tel Aviv and Bat Yam, because Bat Yam is a very small city and Tel Aviv is a little bit big. And by joining the two entities, there will be much more integration. And instead of having two mayors, you'll have one mayor, something that is similar to big cities, for example. And they were trying to do this process for a very long time. But the administration of Bat Yam, of course, they will disagree for that. Because it means the locals are losing a mayor, the locals are losing representation, although they maybe are getting more benefits and welfare and extra budget from the rich Tel Aviv, but it means that the entire administration of Tel Aviv, of Bat Yam, will disappear. Okay, maybe some of them will maintain their jobs, but in the end of the day, you're asking a mayor to give up their job. And this is in a small scale. Now we're talking to do it in a large scale. This is where we will probably see the large political pushback, because in the end of the day, you're asking people to give up not only their way of life, but their own institutions that they've been living with since they were born, actually. So this is why liquidation, it means not only disappearance, but taking away institutional power of local representation to something new that people do not know. This is why historically, those stuff only happen in revolution, those stuff only happen within war, and rarely happens in a peaceful manner. I'm trying to think about
South
in any way.
For example, or the unification of Germany. There are cases where you had peaceful transitions to a single country. You don't necessarily have to liquidate the system that existed before, but rebranding, restructuring. If you merge two major companies, then you could have, they have now one, corporate logo, and you decide, do we keep both logos, or are we going to sort of keep some kind of differentiation? And those are things you could talk about. That when we wrote our flag,
like what ideas would be
keep our flag? Do we each keep our anthem? Those sort of things. And the Palestinian territories are made up of governorates. There's like 20 Palestinian governorates. So those things can now become states within the larger federation. We have mechozot. They have various offices, and those could become the basis for cantons of Israel. And you could sort of use the existing infrastructure and reconfigure it and restructure it to try. You don't want to put people out of work and people who want to be politicians, and they're doing a good job. So if you were the Palestinian regional transportation director for the Nablus area, now you could be the transportation director for the state of Nablus. So, but it's not so much difference. Your business card might change, your logo and your and your office stationary, but more or less you would try to, conserve as much of the existing infrastructure. There's no reason to, to destroy the entire.
I like what you did there, Mike. You're making me imagine.
It's rebranding, reorganization. But there is some people who might be afraid they're going to lose some level of power. So I mean,
it's usually the people who decide, by the way. So
well, I mean, in our vision, we would try to bring it to referendum. I mean, not to make it up to the politicians, because they would be afraid of even a small number of them losing their jobs, or holding new elections where there's now going to be, even if you made more seats, they would not have the same exact structure that they have now. So there would be some resistance. But if you made it a referendum and there was enough support for this referendum on each side, and that becomes signed into law, and that becomes what you do, then you do some kind of rollout, and it's you'd have to design how to do this transition. It would probably be multiple years, where you have to create these states out of whatever subunits of our current governments they'll then make up this sort of integrated system. New elections for a new federal parliament, building state government.
I'm starting
offices.
to think about education also, because I studied in Palestinian schools, and they obviously teach so many that's really different. What kind of history they're going to teach, you know what I mean? In a one-state solution,
it's just a lot of questions. It's a lot of questions, right? Does each state have its own director of education, or is it federal, or is there federal oversight? And in America, you have states, right? So there's a state board of education. I went to a public school in America for a certain period of time, and there was a state of Illinois. I was living in Chicago, and there was a state of Illinois, board of education that ran my school, and they were sort of accountable to the federal board of education that had made standards that the whole country had to keep to. So there's layers of governance, and we have some of that here. It's not everything is run directly out of the Knesset either. So it's something that could be done if there was will. I think that I think it's interesting, at least to explore the idea of what's possible, and not sort of say we have to be married to one idea, when you could get a lot of the same benefits under a federal framework, where you could make some of the issues might become easier, like what to do about Jerusalem. Well, if it's just the capital of your one country, it's a very unusual situation where you'd have two countries sharing one capital. And if these two countries are military, so you have two militaries that defending the same capital, that's
split the capital also. So there's a west and a
that's a situation that doesn't really exist in other countries. You don't usually you don't usually have the border at the capital. That's an unusual. That's sort of what happened in Germany, and then ultimately Germany just sort of became one country, and that was. But then Germans view themselves.
Samaritans and the Jewish people are believed to have been one state, one kingdom, and they split to Judah and Samaria. It wasn't the beautiful.
How did that two-state solution work out, right?
By the way, for your question, it was actually Bratislava, which is actually on the border of Slovakia, but it's far away from the point. But I think I actually disagree, because in the end, the Israeli institution, you're asking not only the people to change their mind, not only the Israeli people, also the Palestinian people, but you're asking also the Israeli institution to change their policy to create a reality of a two states. And I know it sounds surprising for many, but right now the main policy, it's a two states. However, and this is where I'm being very frank with everyone, I don't think that the Israeli government main policy is to create a two state within the vision, how the Palestinian vision of two states.
I wouldn't call it two states. I would call it two entities. It's a Palestinian state minus, I guess, sort of the Bibi doctrine is sort of the reigning vision.
Let's go back to Olmert's vision, actually. In the end of the day, Bibi is out of office right now. And
it's less supportive of right.
So because Bibi's main policy was to do nothing, so he was neither against a one state or a two state, but his main policy was to do nothing. But the main point here is that the Israeli government, and I think we can already see it from Rabin and then Sharon and then Olmert, they're already envisioned a two-state reality. And the thing is, I think what many Palestinians must understand, that Israeli institution will eventually create a two-state reality with the agreement with the Palestinians or without the agreement with the Palestinians.
I don't see it.
And if we see, if we
unless you remove a large number of settlers and create like a clear line, whereas this side is Palestine and this side is Israel. As long as Palestine is a whole series of islands isolated from each other, they can't really create a solid, stable economy that they can run.
Okay,
they can't control roads, they can't control imports. They don't have an airport. It's not a functioning country. It's something like Indian reservations in the United States, a collection of something like Indian reservations.
Okay, so let's not view what we have today, because today, as you said, you're correct. We're talking about Area A and Area B, which is about 40% of the West Bank, is a collection of islands. And most of the in-between is Area C, it's mostly roads. But if we talk about the settlements for 1 second, and if we look at plans that were already drawn back in the 2000s, 2005, 2006, 2008, we're talking about plans that in the end of the day already pretty much drawing a reality that Israel is willing to do on a unilateral way. So it means not what Sharon did, because as you view Sharon plan 2005, it was not only to actually exit Gaza, it was actually to also leave 4 small settlements in the Northwest Bank near Nablus. Okay, and he had actually also a plan 2.0. That map was never published to the public. However, we're talking about a collection of another 16 small settlements, and we're talking about the small ones. We're talking about those who economically will not survive without Israeli security, those who people are driving 2 hours in Israel proper or to a large settlement in order to find work. Those settlements that most of the people work in either security or subsidized by NGOs. So we're talking about those small settlements, but if we evacuate them today, will easily increase the connectivity of the Palestinian and convert to Area A, increase the connectivity of the Palestinian Authority with each other. And we're talking about a reality that is closer and closer to the ability to drive from Hebron to Nablus without seeing one Israeli.
And interesting, because I have a settlement near me, and like there's a road, Har Bracha, and there's a road that if you use, you can save like up to an hour driving.
Correct.
As a Palestinian. So.
And this is the tragedy, by the way, because there are some settlements that, and I don't want to name names because I don't want to put attention on those specific settlements, but there are some settlements that are about 300 and 400 people, okay? And they're isolated from left to right, from north to south. And this specific settlements create the need to drive all around for an extra hour or two in order to arrive from one Palestinian village to another. And this settlements forces the IDF to keep strategic roads, to keep strategic infrastructure, to keep pipelines of water, pipeline of gas or whatever, only because of 300 people. And I'm not saying those 300 people are bad people or good people, but those 300 people in this location create a security reality that is very difficult. And this is why in 2005, one of the main reasons, not the only reason, that they built a security fence, by the way, was not only to increase security and the sense of security to the Israeli population, but it's also to tell the sellers, listen, this is probably will be the future border between Israel and the Palestinian state. This was actually one of the biggest messages of the security wall, was to actually provide a message to the sellers. You need to reconfigure the reality that is going to be in the future. Unfortunately, 2 things happened. One, only the message of this is the future line happened without sticks and carrots to the settlers. So nothing really happened about that. Maybe some did move to a settlement that is within the security line. And in addition to that, nothing happened in expanding or trying to strengthen the PA. And this is why, by the way, we saw the rise of Hamas in 2005. So we learned a lot from the unilateral movements in 2005. And if we look at 2007 already, Olmert already published an entire idea, which is called the Re-Enlightenment plan, which, again, doesn't talk about creating a Palestinian state, but it's about creating something that is more continuous state, creating a reality that the borders of Israel are slowly being materialized in something that is much more clear. And in the end of the day, let's be frank, keeps the settlement block. Because today, most of the growth in the settlements, I think it's about 60 to 80% of the growth in the settlement comes from two main settlements, which are a Haredi settlement, if it's Beitar elite or Maccabi elite, and the immigration to the West Bank by Israelis actually decreased throughout the years since 2005, and most of the growth in the settlements are actually natural growth due to a higher birth rate. And we will see a future, I believe, that if we're even talking a government that is a little bit more centered, or a government that is more similar to Yair Lapid, which he himself, by the way, supported the Realignment Act, will start pushing those kind of ideas. And again, unfortunately, this is the peace podcast. I don't think it will necessarily create more peace, but it will create a great possibility for the Palestinian to upgrade the institutions, to create a better two-state reality for maybe for a future peace agreement to solve the key issues.
That's amazing. I think that you, like when you mentioned the Olmert plan, I didn't hear about that like till now. And you said nothing was executed from that, like settlements were not changed. And, like,
unfortunately, two things happened. Yeah, and this is the tragedy. Maybe the 2006 Lebanese war, which took away Olmert's capital, political capital. He was criticized for his operation of the Lebanese war. And second of all, later on, after he recovered from the big political debacle from the Lebanese war, he got his political problems with his corruption trial, and he was not maybe the right person to do. This is why I personally think Sharon would have been the right person to do what he did. But I do think in the future we do have potential politicians who are as capable, if not more capable than Sharon, to execute those kind of plans. And the Israeli institution, and by the way, also the IDF, is preparing for those plans for many years.
All right. Rafi, in your federation plan, you talked about border. You want to mention something first?
Oh, sure. No. I'll hear your question. Okay,
all right. So, in your federation plan, I saw the map, and I saw that it's going from the farthest north to the farthest south, right? In terms of directions, like, will Palestinians like be able to go like to Eilat or something? That's something I was curious.
No, in the vision that we did, it's one country. You all have the same passport. You're all citizens of the federation, so you could go to any state. We had some rules that when you were a new immigrant, like an Ola Chadash, you have to immigrate like they do in Canada, both to a state and to the federation for a certain number of years, and either stay in that state, or you could apply to move to a different state. But you can travel around, obviously, the state. That's just like to live somewhere. You'd apply to live in a state, and then after you'd been there for a certain number of years, then you were like a veteran citizen of the federation. You could move anywhere, and anyone who was a citizen when the federation started could live anywhere. Like you would have the federation passport.
It's almost like you can upgrade in some ways.
Yeah, you just having been there for a certain number of years, this would sort of filter. If there's a concern that a lot of Palestinians, we would have sort of a similar number of Jews and Palestinians being able to immigrate on an annual basis. So the way to handle like aliyah and right of return, instead of saying, well, we'll just bring 1 million people here next year, that's not really realistic. There's not 1 million empty beds in the country. There's nowhere for them to go. They'll end up like we had with when the major movement of Mizrahi Jews came after the founding of the state. There were people living in tents. It was a shock to the system. There's not enough. You need to have sort of a rate of immigration, and something like before Corona, there was maybe 36,000 Jews making Aliyah every year. So something in that ballpark of
right. I even forgot about Aliyot. Like, how would that?
Right, you could just have a similar number. You put a cap for each side, and that's reasonable for us to build housing for, provide jobs, education, and infrastructure. And you would let an equal number of people from both sides. The current population is roughly half and half, so the population would stay half and half, and that would be the sort of idea on the population. And it would and by making the rule that new immigrants would have to apply to a state, so the state of Tel Aviv could prioritize the Jews making Aliyah, and the state of Nablus would prioritize Palestinians making right of return. And after they had been there for a couple of years, they could then move to the other state after they sort of got used to the vibe. That was sort of, in imagining how we would cope with having one state together, those were sort of the rules we sort of we put together. So yeah, you Aboud would have the Federation passport, and you could go to Eilat, and you're a citizen of the country, and you pay taxes.
Wow. Here's the thing, Rafi. I think that your plan, if you tell it to a Palestinian and he goes on and tells it to publicly, you might think that you might understand what I mean by that, because that it would be harder for a Palestinian to present your plan than for an Israeli. First of all, it's negotiating.
We actually did. Zahir did some pilot polling, and he actually did better amongst Palestinians. When he talked to the PA, he talked to people in the PA, and they had said there is pressure from like European countries that they get money from, and from Americans to sort of toe the two-state line. So they're like, well, we can't go out publicly with this, but if people in private want to do, if it becomes popular enough, then you could sort of move the needle over. So the idea, in order to make this sort of plan something realistic, you'd have to do it grassroots. Like you'd have to convince people to do it, and then they'll convince their politicians. In Israel, we're a democracy, so eventually, if it became popular enough, a party would run, and we would be the Federation Party in the Knesset, and they would get enough seats to be able to pull together a coalition, and they can say, listen, we have enough support for it, let's make this a referendum, we want to bring it to the people and get enough votes to do that, and then that would be the law here to make that happen.
Will there be transportation on Shabbat?
Right, so that would be, it would have to be state by state. Those are the kind of things you'd have to think about, right?
It's still separated in some ways. I see what you mean.
Right. So the state of Jerusalem, in the state of Jerusalem, maybe not, but maybe in the state of Nablus, it's a predominantly Muslim state. You might say, well, if you're Muslim, you don't have to keep Shabbat, so it's, we're not going to make that the rule. But if, in the Jewish neighborhood, well, we're not going to run buses because we don't want to be offensive. You have to figure that out,
It's for the laughs. I think one thing that would be interesting to see if this plan of like a one state or even federation goes is for example, transportation and even food, because one advantage that we have as Samaritans is that we have the salary. We can have the salaries of Israel, and we can have the prices of the West Bank, which is basically low prices, high salaries. So that's one advantage that we kind of are grateful to have in a sense. But will that change if we have a one state?
The economies will start to shift. I mean, there will definitely be. I mean, if you look at the federation map as we had it, the state of Tel Aviv was about half the economy of the entire federation. Basically, in our state of Tel Aviv was from Netanya to Rishon LeZion, and from the Highway 6 to the sea. It's not a very big area, and that's half the economy of all of Israel and all of Palestine put together. So there's definitely going to be disparity, just like California is a wealthier state than Oregon, in America. So yeah, things will be cheaper. Housing will be cheaper in Nablus than it will be in Tel Aviv or Netanya or.
It's already pretty cheap,
and that's the way it is now. But it'll be easier for you to develop the economy, because what's nice about Israel and Palestine is everything's very close. So you could commute to Tel Aviv if you don't yet have a big job infrastructure. You don't have high-tech parks all over Nablus, but if you live in Nablus, you could drive to Netanya in 45 minutes and get a job there, and then over time, companies will realize, hey, I could set up an office in Nablus for half the price. The square footage is going to cost me a lot less, and salaries, I could pay people, 25% less, and they'll be happy because their cost of living is cheaper. So everything is a little bit cheaper in Nablus. Intel might say, hey, I could save 30% to open an office in Nablus, and that'll develop the local economy there. So once you have these states, you have motivation for local people to focus on developing their area, whereas opposed to the current situation in Israel, you have a lot of focus on Jerusalem now a little bit and in the Tel Aviv center area, but the far south of the country and the far north of the country are very poor.
More basic, yeah,
and they're not invested in. Most of the politicians come from either the Tel Aviv area or the Jerusalem area, and most of the voters are there. So they're voting, their interests are support, building nice roads for me in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, but not necessarily in Tveria, because, there's not as many voters in Tveria and that sort of thing. But if Tveria was part of its own state in the Galilee area, they have a ability to tax, and they'd have some budgeting control. You could have, VAT could go to the local state, or various taxes. They could have a budget to start developing better infrastructure, better school, lower tax rates to encourage businesses to move there. So there becomes a lot of things to play with.
It'll be interesting to see Palestinian potential in the work in the high tech world, because I know a lot of friends who work in the high tech world and have crazy potential, but when it comes to bringing like even laboratory things inside the West Bank, that takes a lot of.
I sell laboratory stuff to the West Bank.
For real, so
we do. I have to use. Yeah, there are hurdles. I have to use a subsidiary that's Palestinian, because I can't send Israeli drivers to Nablus to deliver products. If I want to get sent stuff to the University of Nablus or Hebron, I need to get someone.
There's no borders to stop you.
Sure, but then you find someone who has the ability, to go to both places, and you find a place to meet. You can deliver products, and we can make it work. We do.
Sure. No, I see what you mean. It's just that there's one university in, I think it was near Ramallah or something, that got a grant of a laboratory equipment, but it was still denied by the Israeli customs because they were just not convinced that this is for, I think, education, or they did not have proper paperwork or something like that. But you can see that, as a beginning, I don't know if
there are plenty of laboratories in the West Bank. That is for sure. It might have been certain chemicals that they wanted to buy and stuff that was, or was saying dual use. There are some things that tip red flags.
Dushi-mushi in Hebrew they call it. So
dushi-mushi. I mainly deal in biology stuff, so it's less explosive generally. So it's not. I sell stuff for COVID testing or sequencing and stuff like that.
Okay. So not to mention Gaza. Anything that goes to Gaza, that's even different permissions over there. Even a radio or something like that, you'd require a specific permission.
Sure.
For that. Working in the customs, business, and bringing containers outside and inside taught me a lot about how Israelis, the Israeli government, when it wants to bring anything inside the West Bank, even the little details matter. Even if you want to bring a motor that's just connected to you can say a refrigerator or something, is kind of sometimes opened and studied in a way. I bought a package for a friend of mine in Nablus, because kind of it was a motor, and he even had he paid for it. I brought it to him, but he paid for it. He had to pay just for the customs government, or you can call it, or something, just because they checked it. They opened the motor and they checked it. He had to pay for that time also.
Wow, that's annoying.
It's crazy because the motor was not working anymore after they checked it, unfortunately for him. But that's one thing that might, maybe a one state might fix it, or a two state with the proper rights or something like that.
Sure.
So.
And by the way, this is actually where I must say I agree roughly with everything, as long as we replace the people. Because in the end of the day, we are not in this place, but we can talk about having a joint state. Because I do think both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people have a very unique culture, but is very admirable. If it's the Palestinian that has a unique culture in the Arab world, but are more commerce oriented, more because of the historical location they were, so they're more cosmopolitan for many reasons. They have more connection of trade, and this trade you can still see today. I had the pleasure to meet Al-Masri, one of the wealthiest West Bankers, Palestinian West Bankers.
There's Munib Al-Masri,
and you can see the commercial success of the culture of the Palestinian people. While the Israeli people have the great admiration of the high tech and industry and the ability to adapt and change really quickly. However, I think you just described something that just reinforces the two-state reality. Our nature is still very different, if not only politically, but also in the small details. If it's about being more bureaucratic, the Israeli government is a very bureaucratic state for many good reasons and for many bad reasons. And the Palestinian state are still trying to understand what they are. And there is different expectation between the people of Israel and the people of Palestine of what they expect from their own government, not only on the local level, but on the state level. So this is why, again, we're talking about joining two people who have different concept of governance. It's not an immigrant that comes to America and accepts how the American do things and slowly learned about it, and then later on their kids are being installed the American civic religion. We're talking about two people today, but are, let's say, 50-50. It doesn't matter the actual numbers, but have different conception about governance, have different conception of civic duty, civic responsibilities. So this is why, again, I'm saying Rafi reality can be a reality maybe one day, but not with the people we have now. And this is why we need to form, first of all, a place where both sides can heal. And healing doesn't start when the Palestinians today cannot heal with the Israelis. Okay, maybe Israelis can start forgiving to the Arab world of the wars that happened. And this is an Israeli narrative. The Israelis can forgive the Arab world for the wars that happened if it's 48, which Israel lost about 1% of its population, or if it's the Mizrahi and Mizrahi Exodus, or if it's the 67 war. But again, maybe Israel won, but many people died, 73, etc. But I don't think the Palestinians can still start the process of healing with the Israelis, because compared to the Israelis, they don't have their own state. They don't have a way to express their political views. They don't have a way to organize their political views. And the process of starting maybe forming Rafi's reality, which, by the way, it's a reality that I want to see maybe one day. But it only starts when the Palestinians have their own sense of independence, sense of self-respect, dignity, human dignity. And this can only be formed when they have their own political polity and the political independence that they deserve. And this is why, again, I always like to take good examples about history to see where it worked and where it did not work. And I'll say, again, I'm not saying who was a bad guy, who was a good guy, but the reason why, although until today Turkey and Greece are although they're still hostile to each other, in the end of the day, they have two independent polities, two independent political manifestation, but they can at least start forgiving each other. Although it will take many years,
because there's no one who's being treated unfairly in a sense,
right? Because it ended in two states.
It ended in two states for two people. By the way, policy that was very popular in the first. In the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So this is why this policy started from today. Yeah. And this is why I want actually to mention international law. I saw someone commented on this principle. Unfortunately, Rafi's proposal is against international law.
I don't agree.
Well, it's okay. But Israeli government already agreed and promoted the 242 resolution, which does not mention the Palestinians, but in spirit of things does include the Palestinians. And the Israeli government, for this reason, never annexed any part of the territory, but it conquered from the Palestinians, because there was never a resolution to solve this issue. And the Oslo agreement, in the end, but it forces both sides to reach a final resolution. I'm simply in the position right now, but I do honestly think the Israelis and the Palestinians are not in the place to arrive for a final agreement. And this is why it's a place for Israel to do a unilateral move, not only to strengthen the dignity and the independence of the Palestinian, but to create a place where the differences can be closed down and trust can start be built again. Because, and this is again, I think it's something many Palestinians should understand. If Israel will do the first move and the Palestinians will not do the first move, Israel will gain political points from it internationally. And this is why I also implore the Palestinians to understand that time is not on neither side, because if we just wait, it will, I don't know it's actually whose side it's on, but it means the solution will be more ugly. It's still it's much more possible, but it will be more ugly and less desirable to either side. Because I honestly think that we with how we actually stepping today, we'll see a two states without peace. It's something that I don't want to see, but this is how it seems that we're stepping today. And in the end of the day, this is actually what international law requires.
Okay, I want to comment on international law.
Sure.
First of all, the idea of this proposal would be done by referendum and agreement by both sides. This is called a unification. If America and Canada decided tomorrow they wanted to become one country and unify, that's perfectly legal. If all the people in their countries voted for it and they signed an agreement, that is law. It is fine for two countries if you go from the perspective that they should be two countries. So it's not against international law. There is an international momentum towards two-state solution. I could argue that, from a certain perspective, it's not necessarily the default law. There was a British mandate for a single country, just like Lebanon and Syria and Kuwait and Iraq. These were all mandates created by the League of Nations, and they all became countries. And there was a proposal to separate our country into two different countries by the General Assembly. It's a non-binding resolution. The majority of the people in the country were the Palestinians, voted against it. So there was no local support.
Small correction, they never voted for it. So small correction.
So they never voted for it, or the people who are allegedly supporting them were against it. And there was a war between us and our neighboring countries, between particularly Jordan and Egypt. We've since signed a peace agreement with Jordan and Egypt, and they did not make any claims to the territory. So you could argue that the territory goes back to the mandate and that we're really one country. Now opinion, Israelis argue against that position strongly because they don't want the solution that I'm proposing. So the Israeli governments have long pushed with American support against that interpretation of the law. So the idea that we are two countries is the majority opinion of the world's legal thinkers. But if we chose democratically to become one country, no one's going to stop us. That would be the law. We would sign an agreement, and we could make that the law.
But
my next point was, I'll let you get something in.
Sure. No,
I want to say
after your next point.
Sure. About the change, I agree. You would need to not necessarily switch people, but you need to change mindset. I mean, in order to make this happen, it is a big leap. That's one of the first things I said. It's not impossible. There are cases where you didn't end up with
mindset in the sense that you mean like beliefs and ideologies.
Belief that we could live together as equals in one country and still sort of maintain enough cultural autonomy to feel like I'm an Israeli, for him to feel like he's Palestinian. I can still have my cultural national identity within the framework of some kind of federation, which is a leap. It's a conceptual jump, but there are advantages to making that leap. There are places in the world where such things have happened. Black people in America didn't immigrate under the law. They were prisoners, captured and sold into slavery. They ended up getting rights because the idea of giving them a separate state was not feasible. They were very culturally different than the white people that were enslaving them, but they all ended up getting rights. There was, under apartheid South Africa, there were very different cultures. They were very different statuses of how these were living. The blacks.
I think there'll be a speech one day of "I Have a Dream" by Luther, but for the Palestinians.
Right. You need a Palestinian Martin Luther King or a Gandhi, certainly. That's definitely a prerequisite to pulling this off. But there are cases where it ended up as one country. Bosnia-Herzegovina, Northern Ireland, or within the United Kingdom, but as sort of an entity within the United Kingdom. South Africa, as I mentioned, and Germany, you could argue that during the separation between West and East Germany, they had developed very different outlooks of life. One was socialist, one was capitalist. So you can bring people together that have different outlooks on life and find a way to make equality or some kind of framework where, especially within a federal framework, where you could have states that are Palestinian states and states that are Israeli states within the framework of a federation, like you have in Belgium. You have Wallonian states and you have Flemish states and French-speaking states. So you could have something like that. It's not impossible, but it is challenging to our way we view ourselves and challenging to the way Palestinians view ourselves. That's certainly true.
Right. Apparently, also Daniel says here there are some black people in the U.S. who want their own state separate. I didn't hear about that. Okay, interesting.
It's not likely to happen.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's also especially about like skin color and everything.
Sure.
All right, so we're almost actually out of time. Or if you do want to add one more thing, you're more than welcome to do that.
Of course, and this is maybe as I think it's something you mentioned. My biggest challenge is, which I think you agree to, the biggest challenge. If everyone will vote for your proposal, let's go for it.
Yeah,
that's simple. However, I don't think, I actually almost 100% sure that we will not see a consensus the moment that the details will go out, the moment people understand how the system will work. Some will see the proposal, which I believe I did see your proposal. It's the 30 cantons, yes, if I'm not mistaken.
I know that's the Emmanuel Shachef. I actually made the map for that plan. I started working with the Tnuat Federatia, and then I came up with my own version, which was 16 cantons, half Jewish, half Palestinian.
Many people will think it's gerrymandered in some ways. Correct me if I'm wrong. People will probably imagine that. People will imagine that the political rights will not be equal. People actually will understand, but this is not their vision, because one vision of one state is them controlling the other, and one on the other side as well. So I do think in reality, both nations actually are searching a state of their own, okay? A state that will represent their cultural identity, but will represent their political aspiration, and not necessarily a state that will be neutral to their aspiration. And this is why, again, I'm saying I will support your plan, but I'm not seeing it happening with the current people. If you'll successfully educate about 14 to 16 million people, go for it. I'm supporting your aspiration completely. I do think it's the right direction for humanity in the long run. However, again, this is when we enter to the details. Belgium was a forced creation of the British after the Napoleonic Wars. Black Americans, they were never asked about what do they actually want. Some people say Liberia, but Liberia is a small example. In the end of the day, they were a minority of a minority of a minority, but still suffered 100 years after the Civil War. So it's not something the Palestinians are actually seeking as well. We're in the end of the day, we're looking at old world nationalism that the Palestinian people do hold, and also nationalism that Israeli people hold. And now you're asking them to denationalize a process that, again, I do not know many cases of denationalization of entire people in a very short time period of time. So it's something that I still don't have the imagination for, but I will be happy to see this kind of reality. But in the meanwhile, until we arrive to your reality, Rafi, I do believe it's the responsibility of the Israeli government to do everything it can to, first of all, create the reality that we are separating from the Palestinians, not only, by the way, for ourselves, not only because it's our strategic goal in the long run, and not only because it's the right thing, but in order for the Palestinians to have the opportunity to create the institutions they need in order to de-radicalize themselves. Because right now, the only thing they see that is successful, if it's correct or incorrect, it's irrelevant. They see that resistance or warfare is the only tool that actually achieves something. I personally believe it's a misrepresentation of what happened historically, but this is what many Palestinians believe.
A lot of people do believe that. Yeah, you're right.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't have an opinion exactly, and a lot of people want peace. I have a lot of different friends who have different opinions of what might work.
Mm-hmm. So in order to create let's call it rebranding the process, we need to create a reality to show that diplomacy is the tool and not war. And this is something Israel can try. I'm not saying it's lack of risks, but also doing nothing has a lot of risk within it.
Any shot's not taken is a missed shot. So
exactly, sure. I'm in the world of finance. I can tell you that. But if I every stock that I invest in has risks, and of course an upside and a downside. But the biggest risk is actually holding cash. So cash, it's not doing anything. So also here, not doing anything, it's a risk by itself. I think Israel had been taking this risk for too long. I think the Palestinians, by the way, also did many mistakes, but it's irrelevant because I'm not Palestinian. I cannot decide their own fate. So the question now today, Rafi, is sure, I will support your plan if we have enough people who will support this kind of plan. But I think this plan can only happen with two equal entities that are independent, but can feel enough confidence with their identity, with their political independence and aspirations to agree to this kind of a joint future. I'm in the place of evolutionary process, less a revolutionary. So I think those stuff takes time. I think those stuff needs to happen in a way that maintains stability for both population, because I don't want to see another war happening. And unfortunately, if we implement something like a one state today, I do see a Yugoslavian situation easily being escalated very quickly. And, in my job, when I was in the military, our main goal was actually de-escalation. And de-escalation is, I'll say, a vague concept in many ways. In Hebrew, we even call it halacha. And the idea, in the end of the day, is to see what tactically, it's to, first of all, understand strategically you cannot solve the problem, but to see what tactically you can do to change the reality. And by slowly dealing with those small tactical problems, and you can actually slowly bridge the gap between the two sides to eventually have a much more fruitful relationship, in order to have a much more fruitful place of negotiation and solving the bigger picture. Because a collection of many small moves is a collection of a big, it's in the end of the day will be a big move. And Israel today has many collection of small moves that it can do today, but are actually already withdrawn by politicians and by generals, by the way, also by the business community. And many people will be surprised also by the with negotiation with the Palestinians. So what we agreed today, let's implement it today. We don't need to wait more. And as Israeli, I do implore as Israelis to understand that we can do stuff today. It doesn't mean that we'll achieve peace tomorrow, but it does mean we need to approach to be in a better place that peace is more possible. Because again, if we want to see a one-state solution, I do still think we need to have first a two-state structure, but slowly integrate to a one-state.
All right.
Okay. I would say I agree with a lot of things that Or just said there. I think that in terms of, as an Israeli, I think we should do as much as we can to try to minimize the conflicts. I mean, I don't think we should do massive expansion of settlements outside of, legitimate natural growth. I don't think we shouldn't go crazy. We should do whatever steps we can to minimize the effects of the conflict on your average Palestinian, whether it's visas, whether it's reducing checkpoints, whether it's making customs things more efficient, whatever you can. And those steps will hopefully make the opportunity for us to come to some solution. I personally, as an Israeli, if we could have a version of Or's plan of a two-state solution come to referendum and the vast majority of people on both sides agree to it, I would also vote yes. I want my kids to have a nice future here, and I want to live in peace. So I would be fine with that. I think it's also our obligation as Israelis, as people in a very unique situation in a dangerous part of the world, to try thinking outside the box sometimes and explore alternatives and think, imagine what are our other options if this two-state solution, if there's, let's say we have goodwill, but we just can't figure a way to get this two-state, maybe there's another way to look at it where we could also succeed. And building all the infrastructure of good relations as neighbors is definitely something we should do in the meanwhile. Anyways, that's
for sure.
Whether
that's
person to person or our government to government, that should definitely go. And but we'll still keep doing our thinking and promoting the alternatives to a two-state that are also good, and I think that are worth this thinking about and worth imagining.
Yeah, for sure. We do have to start working already on getting people more face to face, because I think the internet tends to, bring people more towards hate. On comments, for example, it's easier for you to be behind a screen and comment bad stuff, but when you're face to face, it's a little bit different. Things get more real, I believe. And I think that, even though it's not that easy to make, but Mount Gerizim, where I live over here, I think is one out of a few places where both Israelis and Palestinians can meet and maybe talk about it, things that they want to share and express to each other, because we don't have that a lot, if you know what I mean. Some people might think we're naive when we talk about a future where Palestinians and Israelis do sit together and like more than we have today, because I do have a lot of meetings where both come here, and it's like I see beautiful. Like I do see light at the end of the tunnel. Let's start from that. About 10 years ago, I used to not see light at the end of the tunnel yet. I was like, maybe this will take like 200, 300, 500 years. But now I think maybe we're going to somewhere. And like I love both people. I have friends from both sides. That's why I really don't want to see anyone, suffering from both sides. All right, I think this is where we are going to end the episode, guys. I really wish we could do this longer. There's definitely going to be more episodes on a one-state, two-state solution, and you're more than welcome to come in the future episodes. But truly, it has been an honor. I learned a lot. This is something that I don't do much when it comes, like, I never hosted an episode that talks this deep about this kind of specific topic, and you guys did a really wonderful job of giving us like a glimpses of what this might mean if we do have either one-state or two-state solution. So thank you for that. And one more thing I think would be mentioning is maybe when we have either one-state or two-state solution, maybe this could be like, I don't know, what will you write behind this one? Like, who made it? Like, where would this be made in?
In my vision, it would be made in Israel, Palestine, or sure. Palestine, Israel. Depends who your target audience is.
In case you don't know, this is, by the way, tahini made by my family. It's called Kar Bracha tahini. Yes, get it now. Really healthy and very nutritious. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for following. I haven't been on in a long time on the podcast, so it's wonderful to come back. Stay tuned for more. It's gonna be a really nice year. If you haven't subscribed already, leave a like on this video, comment, and we'll also put the links to Rafi and or related links. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Have a nice evening or morning wherever you are in this amazing world. See you later, everyone. Bye-bye.